Welcome to episode 298 of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. I'm a retired agent on a mission to show you who the FBI is and what the FBI does through my books, my blog, and my podcast case reviews with former colleagues. Today, we get to speak to, once again, retired agent Jonny Grusing, who served in the FBI for 25 years. In this episode, Jonny reviews his and his National Park Service co-case agent Beth Schott's investigation of Harold Henthorn for murdering his first and second wives. They gathered the evidence to prove the murders were premeditated and made to look like accidents. Henthorn's wife, Lynn, was crushed when he caused a car to fall on her, and his wife, Toni, died after he pushed her from a cliff while they were hiking in Rocky Mountain National Park. Before their deaths, both wives were dominated by Henthorn, who they thought was a strong, successful Christian man. During Jonny's career, he worked violent crime to include bank robberies, kidnappings, missing persons, serial rapists, serial killings, and special jurisdiction homicides. In 2008, Grusing was named as the Behavioral Analysis Unit BAU coordinator for Colorado, consulting on difficult or unusual homicides or missing persons cases throughout the state. Jonny is currently the Director of Safety and Security for the Douglas County School District in Colorado and manages his own investigative consulting service. He is completing a book about his investigation of serial killer and former FBI informant, Scott Kimball. He reviewed this case on FBI Retired Case File Review, episode 276. Now, before we get to the interview, I want to reveal the identity of my headliner guest for the 300th episode of FBI Retired Case File Review. Let me tell you, I swung for the fences and scored big with a 40-minute plus interview with current FBI Director Christopher Wray. Woohoo! I asked him the questions I thought you would want me to cover. The epic episode will be released on the evening of Wednesday, November the 1st. Also on the show will be best-selling author and National Academy graduate Isabella Maldonado to discuss writing about the FBI and crime fiction, and retired agent and TV producer Ann Began to talk about the FBI and true crime. It is what I'm calling a mic drop event. You can listen to a 30-second clip of my interview with the director on social media or in my October Reader Team email, which I wrote about attending Crime Con 2023 in Orlando last month. Wow, what a powerful and unbelievable conference. Now remember, I started this podcast because I was trying to find potential readers for my crime novels. So if you want to show me your love for putting out 300 plus episodes, please consider buying my 2 FBI crime novels, Pay to Play and Greedy Givers, available as ebooks, paperbacks, and audiobooks wherever books are sold. Don't forget, I'm traveling to Brazil and Argentina in mid-October, so I'm going to post episode 299 a week early on October 11th, the day before I leave for my trip. On October 18th, I will re-release an archive episode. It's the case review that made me realize that hosting and producing FBI Retired Case File Review had become a mission for me. Can you guess which episode it is? I've mentioned it several times before. In your podcast app's description of this episode, you'll find links to where you can join my reader team, buy me a cup of coffee, and learn more about me and my books. Thank you for your support. Now here's the show. I want to welcome my guest back again, retired agent Jonny Grusing. Hey, Jonny, how are you?
Hi, Jerry. I'm doing great. How are you doing?
I'm doing good. Now, the last time we talked, It was episode 276, and we talked about Scott Kimmel, who was, it's a strange, like an oxymoron for me to say that he was a strange serial killer because aren't they all? But his story was absolutely fascinating. And if listeners haven't heard episode 276, after they listen to this one about another strange murderer, then they should go back and listen to that one.
Yeah, I learned a lot from Scott Kimball. As I said, he was a 15-year ordeal for me, but I learned so much from him. And I took the things, Jerry, that I learned from interacting with Scott and his complexity, his manipulation, and his, what's the best way to put it, eagerness to kill people and get away with it. And I applied the Scott principles to the case we'll talk about today.
Now, the case that we're talking about today, there have been a number of podcast episodes out there with other podcasters on this investigation. I think that this will probably be the first one where somebody who actually was involved in the investigation has taken listeners through the case. So I really appreciate you being here today. I think before we go into the details, if we could first explain to everyone how the FBI got involved in it, because the FBI normally, although you see it a lot on true crime shows, but the FBI really doesn't normally get involved in murder and missing person type cases. There has to be a federal nexus. And so before we go into the details, could you talk a little bit more about that?
You're exactly right, Jerry. We don't investigate simple homicides. That's the county and municipal and city police departments that investigate those. This one, though, happened in Rocky Mountain National Park, which does have exclusive federal jurisdiction. So the FBI partnered with the National Park Service, and we became the primary investigators because this is federal land.
All right. So where do you want to start with the case?
So I'd probably like to start with this coming out in the paper. I remember reading it. I subscribe to the newspaper, so I see what's going on. I even do it now, even though it's digital. But I remember, Jerry, reading this article, and we have people fall from mountains, unfortunately, I wouldn't say all the time, but very frequently. We've had a couple, even last month here in Colorado, where you see the little articles that someone fell to their death. And I remembered reading this one, and the obituary was that Toni Henthorn, age 50, passed away on Saturday, September 29th, 2012, as a result of a tragic accident in Rocky Mountain National State Park. Talks about when she was born, that she was a physician, incredibly loved, and that her surviving spouse was Harold Henthorn. September of 2012, I wasn't assigned in this case. I wasn't involved in it for almost 2 years. The year 2012 was a very challenging year for us in the Denver FBI. We had the Aurora theater attack, and following that, I and another agent investigated a woman in Charleston, South Carolina, who had tried to, on Facebook, get 70 to 90 people to come attack Littleton and Columbine the night of that Aurora theater attack because she had seen online what had happened. And I spent 2 months investigating that and arresting her, going out to South Carolina. Then we had Jessica Ridgway disappear. She was a 10-year-old walking to school on October 5th, 2012. That took every day of a lot of our lives for almost 2 months until we were able to bring her killer to justice, but that sucked a lot of life out of everyone. And we had another missing child, Dylan Redwine. So 2012 was a very busy year for me, and I was not involved at all in Toni's death. However, it was assigned to an FBI agent to work with the Park Service to try to figure out if this was a push or a fall because of Harold's very odd statements that he had made to the Park Service when the ranger had arrived on scene. So to Harold's odd statements, the vast area that they were in and the remoteness of this cliff, and the unlikelihood that a 50-year-old highly accomplished doctor in Cherry Creek would just plunge over the edge. And finally, life insurance policies on her that National Park Service discovered were secretive but in existence all led to a ton of red flags. So the FBI and the Park Service investigated this through 2013. So my first interaction with this case came in the summer of 2013. I was at an Einstein's coffee shop in Highlands Ranch, which is where both I live and Harold Henthorn lives. And my wife and I were there grabbing coffee, and I saw our evidence response team, all of them dressed up, ready to go for a search in my neighborhood. So I asked them what was going on, and they said they were searching Harold Henthorn's house. And I put it together. That was the woman who fell from the cliff. Yes. And they told me a little bit about the case. And one of the interesting things they were looking for was a diamond, which we'll talk about later. So I was briefed on the case just over coffee. And then a few months later, I was walking down the hall in the FBI building, and I ran into the case agent. His name's Chris. And Chris asked me what I thought about Harold being a serial killer. And I said I didn't really know much about the case. And he said, well, Harold disappears on Thursdays, and he has for 20 years. Chris was confident that Toni was pushed, not an accidental fall over the edge of the cliff that day in September 2012. But he said that Harold's first wife had died also in a freak accident way back in 1995. And he said the mysteriousness of both freak accidents, killing wives, Harold benefiting financially, and then him disappearing on Thursdays for a 20-year period was very suspicious. And he thought Harold might be going out to kill people. So we talked about Serial Killers 101, which I had learned from the Behavior Analysis Unit. And I told Chris, let me know if I can help, but it was his case.
All right. Could you, for those who haven't had a chance to listen to episode 276, can you talk about why he's asking you, why he's coming to you, and your connection with the Behavioral Analysis Unit down in Quantico?
Sure. Yeah, starting in 2006, so 7 years before this, I had been investigating Scott Kimball, who was an informant of ours who had killed multiple people unbeknownst to the FBI. And that right now, we think it's over a 20-year period. And by 2009, I was going out on body hunts in the desert and in the mountains with Mr. Kimball to recover some of his victims. And then I had worked closely with the profiling unit because I had no idea how to deal with serial killers. And they were spectacular in coaching me and bringing me along. Following the Kimball case, which continued to go even after his sentencing because we were investigating more and more victims, I was assigned to work other one-time, very interesting cases that required a liaison with the profiling unit. And this was one of them. So for now about 7 years, I was working cases like Harold's with the assistance of the profiling unit. That was November of 2013 when I had the conversation with Chris. And then fast forward to May of 2014, my boss called me in his office, my supervisor, and said, the U.S. attorneys have asked that you come look at this Harold Henthorn case, and asked if I would go meet them at the office. I said, absolutely. So I went and met with what became a fantastic team. The team was Valeria Spencer, prosecutor, Sunita Hazra, prosecutor, Beth Schott, who was the Park Service agent, and Dana Chamberlain, who was our finance wizard. And they explained to me the oddness of Harold and the unlikelihood that Toni went over the edge. And then an aside, Jerry, was the really strange aspects of his first wife, Lynn, dying when a Jeep fell on her. But that had been ruled an accident now 20 years ago. And it seemed to be done as a case, but it was very suspicious. So they asked if I would walk up Deer Mountain with them to see the site where they believe Harold pushed Toni over and to see if we could move this case forward somehow towards prosecution, because Beth, the Park Service agent, had done a tremendous amount of work on this case, done a lot of search warrants, interviews, found that Harold had $4.5 million worth of insurance on Toni when she went over the edge of the cliff, and that he was not truthful with the Park Service about the amount of insurance on Toni. But the bottom line was they could not prove the difference between a push and a fall. and you only had one person telling a story. It's Harold. And Harold said this was Toni's fault, that she was not paying attention. She was trying to get a picture of him, and she went over the edge, but Harold did not see that. He was looking at a soccer text. The soccer text turned out to be very problematic for Harold because he did not have his timetable straight, which we really worked on for the next couple of months. But back to that day in 2014, we walked up Deer Mountain. And in case you've ever hiked one of the mountains in Colorado, this was a moderate hike. Moderate means that the trail is easily or very clearly marked. It's the dirt gravel, and you even have the logs built in where you can get your stepping going up. And it takes you about an hour to get near what would be the summit of it. What Beth, though, had been up there, for 2 years walking this thing to and fro, and she found where Harold had taken Toni off trail. Now, off trail means there's no markings. It's heavily forested. You're walking over huge trees that have fallen in between very dense forest at times, and you lose your bearings pretty quickly. But Beth knew exactly where she was going, and she took us off trail for 20 minutes and took us to what she called the lunch spot. The lunch spot is a place that's, again, it's about a 20-minute walk. It's not that far, maybe only a mile, but it takes forever to get there from the trail. And then you have a panoramic view of the mountains. There's big rocks going downward. And Harold had taken one of the last selfies of himself and Toni at this, quote, lunch spot. And they're both smiling, look like they're having a great time on this hike.
So it's off trail, but hikers do go there because of the view.
We don't know that anybody had gone here, Jerry. We figured that they had because of the view, but there's no spot there that had, any sort of markings or food or whatever. It's looking backwards now. It took Harold a long time to find this place. But no, in Colorado, hikers go everywhere. So I'm sure somebody had been here before, but there's nothing clearly marked about it.
All right. So the name Lunch Spot was just something that Beth
That's
made
right.
up. It wasn't. Okay. So I was seeing it as a marking on a map, Lunch Spot. Let me ask you just one question. Was Harold a hiker? I understand that Toni wasn't, but was Harold?
Harold liked to be outdoors, and they hiked some around their cabin, which was by a lake. It's about an hour drive from here, back further in the mountains. But he wasn't super athletic. I mean, he's in his mid to late 50s at this point. Not in great shape, but not in horrible shape. Toni had had 3 significant knee surgeries by this time. She was a good athlete in high school, basketball player, but by this point, she wasn't super mobile, and she didn't ski and stuff like that. So if she skied, it was, very carefully. So she would have done this, in our opinion, and this, of course, hindsight's 2020, just to please Harold to go up on this hill, because this was their 12th wedding anniversary. And Harold had called her office, the Cherry Creek Eye Surgeons, about 2 weeks ahead of time to set up him swooping in as a surprise and whisking her out of work to take her to the Stanley Hotel, which is near the bottom of Deer Mountain. Have you heard of the Stanley Hotel before?
No, I haven't. Is it a famous spot?
It is. It's famous to us around here because it was the hotel referred to in The Shining. That's the Jack
Oh,
Nicholson
okay.
story. So it's pretty creepy that he was taking her to the Stanley, but everybody, including Toni's friends there at work and whatever, thought, well, Harold's whisking her off to this romantic hotel, right, for their anniversary. Instead, they go on this pretty difficult hike, especially considering Toni's knees, and they're at the top of the hill. Then they go off trail for 20 minutes. And then from this lunch spot, and we named these so we could have them clearly in our minds where they were, but you're right, it wasn't a lunch spot for anybody else but them. Then they hike down over these 3 to 4 foot jagged boulders to go to the cliff. And the cliff is very dangerous. You can walk up to it. You can see it barely from the lunch spot, but it takes another 20 minutes you can't even walk down these boulders. You have to go sit on your butt, get your legs to find footing for the next rock, step there, sit on your butt, find your footing for the next rock, because there's nothing easy about this pathway down, and there's no path. That's one you make of it. But this had to be even more difficult for Toni to follow Harold down to the edge of this cliff. And when you finally get to the cliff that Beth took us to, it had what's called a crow's nest. And I learned a crow's nest is a little half semicircle that sticks up about 2 feet off the ground, that you can come and put your knees up against if you want. But it's almost a designed piece in that rock face to keep you from walking straight over the edge of the cliff. So Toni and Harold had taken pictures of each other at this crow's nest, and that's supposedly where Toni went right over the edge. And that's what Harold said. She went over the edge. He said he wasn't looking at the time, but she definitely was pushed, we believe at this point, over the cliff, because right from that crow's nest straight down about 130 to 150 feet is where she finally impacted, and Harold recovered her down there. So Beth, once you go to that push, we called it the lunch spot and the push spot, or the cliff. So once you look at that, Jerry, there is no reason for anybody to be close to that thing or stand up on it. It doesn't have any better view than the lunch spot did, and it is very, very dangerous because the fall would be straight down. There were pictures, like I said, on both phones. Toni would get her knees up against that crow's nest, but she would not raise up from the sitting position. We have one picture of her close to it. You can tell she's posing for Harold, pretending like, in our opinion, that she's having fun. Harold, however, had Toni take pictures of him as he's standing up on the ledge of this thing, looking down, which is crazy dangerous. I mean, I don't even think I would have done that when I was 17 years old.
Do you think?
In our opinion,
Go ahead.
no, I think you're thinking the same thing I am, and it is. I think he was coaxing her to stand up there,
Yes,
and say, "You've got to look at this." And yeah, you're exactly right. We don't believe she did, and it's because of some of the clues Harold gave us later on. So from that very dangerous cliff spot, Beth walked us around. There's almost a curved way to get down to the bottom where Toni was recovered by the Rangers. And it took us about 7 minutes to hike down there. And we weren't running, we were hiking fairly fast, but it's a lot easier to get to than that from the lunch spot to the push spot. So the recovery spot down there, Beth showed us where Harold had taken her out of a tree. She had impacted a tree, and he had dragged her to a place of what he would say safety. It was about 10 feet below the tree. But what Beth said, the coroner had told us, is that Toni had most likely bled out there. But that's where Ranger Faraday found her. It took the Rangers 2 hours to find her at the bottom of that cliff. So top of the cliff, bottom of the cliff, and Harold said, again, when Toni went over the edge, he was looking at the soccer text. The soccer text came from the babysitter who was watching their 7-year-old daughter, Haley, and the soccer text said that Haley's team had won, and the score was 5-1. And Harold said he was looking at that text when Toni went over the edge. That's why he didn't see it. I think it'd be good for your listeners to hear the 911 call. It's only about 1:30 seconds. Harold made this call when he was at the bottom of the cliff. He had pulled Toni out of the tree, and he called dispatch. So I think now would be a good time to play it.
All right.
Rocky Mountain National Park. Where's your emergency?
This is Estes, and we have a gentleman on Deer Mountain. Go ahead, sir.
Thank you. My wife has fallen from a rock on the north summit of Deer Mountain, on the Deer Mountain Trail, and she's in really critical condition. She's had a bad fall.
How far did she fall, sir?
30, 40 feet, 30 feet.
You think 30, 40 feet?
I think 30 feet.
30 feet. Are you with her now?
I can't be sure. I am. Let me be sure that you know my location first before we have really bad cell coverage.
Okay.
Okay, I'm on Deer Mountain.
Okay.
Near the summit, not the normal, regular northern summit, on the southern outcrops.
Southern outcrops?
If you look at from up south from the Fall Mountain Visitor Center, there are 2 very large outcrops. We are not on either one of those two. We are between the two.
You're between the two outcrops that you can see from FRE, from Fall River.
We are approximately 9,800 feet. I've got a table to you. Let me see if I can give you a launch.
Okay.
Latitude, north latitude, about 23 minutes, about 15 seconds. Longitude, west 105, approximately.
I'm sorry, west where?
105 degrees west, longitude. Latitude, 35 minutes, approximately 20 seconds. I'll say again, we are not on the two large, steep outcrops. Okay. We're in the area between them.
On two deep outcrops, but in between. Hold on for 1 second.
Okay, all right, thanks.
Okay, who am I talking to?
My name is Harold Henthorn.
Are you with the patient?
Yes, I am, yes.
I already have rangers getting ready to come up there, so if you're at FRE looking at Deer Mountain, you're looking at two outcrops and this person's between the two outcrops?
Yes, if you're looking from the visitor center directly south, magnetic south, you'll see two large outcrops about 9,800 feet, very steep. We are not on those two. We are between the two, about 200 feet off the crest of the hill.
And tell me some things about the patient.
She is a white female, 50 years old, great health. She has respiration approximately 5 to 8 beats a minute. Her pulse is about between 60 and 80 beats a minute.
Okay, what's her main injury?
Head injury.
Head injury.
Concussion.
Okay, any other injuries?
To be internal,
Is she conscious and breathing?
No, she's not. She has not been conscious. She is breathing. Between 5 and 8 beats a minute now.
Okay. Hold on just a second.
Okay.
Okay. Yep, they'll keep her warm. So I'm going to keep on doing 2 breaths and then 30 pumps. Okay, and tell me when you start with the 2 breaths.
You're telling me exactly what I've been doing.
Okay, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to count for you as you go through the breaths. I got my computer on and I can count so we can make sure we're getting that blood flow.
We still have battery left. I've got to turn off because.
Okay.
Have to find me.
Okay, I will let you go. Call 911 anytime.
And again, instead of calling right when she fell before he made his way down there, he waited until he got all the way to where she was and moved her before he made this call.
He not only did that, that's an excellent observation. He waited, so we believe that she was last alive on the cliff face at 5 o'clock p.m., based upon all the photos. He does not make the 911 call, Jerry, until 5:55 p.m. So it's a 7-minute hike down there, and we're missing about 45 to 50 minutes before he actually calls 911. Another big problem for Harold was that when he got down to the bottom of the cliff, he does not even turn his phone on until 5:54 p.m. At 5:54 p.m., that is when the soccer text comes in. Haley, their team won 5-1. You remember what he said before is that's the reason why he didn't see Toni go over the edge of the cliff. This is 54 minutes later.
All right. I can see why, as they were investigating this, these little red flags started making them think there may be more to this than a simple fall from a cliff.
Yep. Well, there's so many things that are troubling about the call. It's his tone of voice. It's his detail, intense detail. It took us a while, probably 10 to 15 times to listen to it to catch the very subtle statement Harold makes, and it's, I want to be sure you know my location. Again, he's asking for a rescue team to come save his wife. He doesn't even mention Toni. He doesn't even mention my wife and I. He says my location. He's talking to the dispatch operator like I'm talking to you right now. The lack of any sort of urgency in Harold's voice, and he's intent that she gets the detail he wants her to have. And it's not focused at all on Toni. It's all about him and how much he knows. Harold provided his latitude and longitude coordinates. He even interrupted the operator to do that. So he said, hold on just a second. Let me give you my lat and long, which is latitude and longitude. And he goes down to the minutes and seconds. He was actually off a little bit because that sent the ranger close to him, but not actually there. That he knows the lat and long of his particular location is troubling because Toni was the one that wanted to go to this dangerous edge. Toni was the one that wasn't paying attention. Toni's the one that fell. So he's blaming the whole thing on Toni, and yet he's providing the lat long to someone who he should not know those sorts of things. So this was very effective for the jury. We believe we were watching them, and the dispatcher testified. She, of course, lots of bad things happen in the mountains, and she had heard hundreds of 911 calls, and she had never heard one like this. When I was listening to this and thinking of my other cases that I had worked, that's all narcissistic behavior. And he's just wanting the dispatcher to focus on him and not his wife. He actually says she'd only fallen 30 feet when she had fallen closer to 150. They still got out there very quickly, but if they had known it was 150 feet, it would have been a different conversation. So he's controlling everything about the conversation. And Jerry, at the very end, he goes, I have to go after only a minute 30 seconds because my battery is low. After that 911 call, he texted 98 times with friends and made 22 phone calls. He wanted to get off the phone quickly because he had to control the conversation. So in that whole scene, in digesting that with Valeria, Sunita, Beth, and Dana, I found that Harold had done some things very well there, that he had isolated his victim. Nobody would have seen this thing happen. It was way out in the middle of nowhere in the mountains. Yes, Harold changed his stories, but there's only one story to tell, and that it's Toni's fault. He blames the victim, which I often see even in familial homicides. It's the victim's fault. And he can't describe the last scene, which that's a really interesting one for me. I've worked a couple of child homicides and other spousal homicides. If you have a loved one you kill, you don't see what happened to them at the end. And after Kimball and Harold and some others, I really pushed some other family members and some other family homicides to say, tell me what you last saw. Because Harold blaming the soccer text is obviously not true. He saw her go over the edge, and he had multiple reasons to see that and to say it, but he can't. And the reason I believe today is because it's so awful that you're killing the mother of your child and someone you care about in a very dysfunctional way. I mean, I think for Harold it's more self-serving, but it's so awful to kill someone that you love and then have to describe anything about it.
That makes sense, because if you truly want someone to believe that your spouse has fallen, describing it, would make it more real and, as verification for your story. But you're right. He can't seem to say it because he knows he's responsible.
Yeah, so let's move down to the bottom of the cliff where Beth walked us through what Harold did, which is very disturbing. So Toni had impacted a tree, and she had even broken the branch, severed it, and it was about 4 or 5 inches in diameter. It was a huge branch. From the tree she was caught up in, Harold had dragged her down by her feet. And he told her parents, one of the first things he told her parents when they got in town, he took her parents, they flew in from Mississippi. Next morning, Harold takes them down to the basement. They're a wonderful couple. I've become good friends with both of them. Her dad, Bob, passed away last year. Her mom, Yvonne, was also a nurse and was spectacular in her testimony. She looks just like Toni. Toni looks like her. So it was almost like Toni getting up on the stand and testifying. But Bob and Yvonne fly in from Mississippi. Harold takes them down to his basement, and he explains what I told you before, that they had taken this hike, that Toni wanted to go down to this place, that she had seen some turkeys on the mountain, which that's a whole nother rabbit trail. We don't think turkeys go that high up mountains, but that wasn't something that they could prove in court. But then once they get down to this ledge, that Toni was trying to get a picture of him. And he looks at the soccer text, and her knees give way, and she backs up and falls overward. So he adds the knee issue because he knows that they know that she had 3 knee surgeries. the next thing that he says, which was so disturbing, is that he says, I got her out of the tree and I pull her by her feet and pants out of the tree. And as I'm taking her down, her head is banging on rocks until I get her to this place where I'm able to lay her down.
What? He told that to her parents?
Absolutely. And everything else, Jerry, was Toni's fault. Toni wanted to go down to the edge. Toni was near the edge. Toni wasn't paying attention. Toni's knee gave way. The only thing that he took, if you would say, a responsibility for is dragging her and her head hitting the rocks. And they were appalled. And the reason is at the crime scene, you have from that tree down to where Toni was laid, hair and blood as her head was hitting the rocks going down. So we couldn't figure that out for a long time, but we think we figured out.
And what was his reason for not just picking up his wife and carrying her lovingly to a better spot, or just leaving her at the base of the tree?
That's a great question. And even for us, a bigger one is, why is he blaming himself? Why is he taking any responsibility for doing something awful to Toni, right? When everything else is her fault. But we think he's covering up something that happened at the top of the cliff. We, being Beth and her team, never recovered the binoculars that Toni was last looking out of. So Beth, I think she even thought this before I did, but we all came to somewhat of an agreement. There's a reason why, and it is that Toni was smart enough not to stand up on the edge of that cliff. And we believe Harold had to knock her over the back of the head with those binoculars and push her over. Now, if she's got most of the trauma to Toni, which, by the way, she was killed in about 4 different ways, but the coroner believes she was alive for about an hour once she impacted that tree. So she was killed by a huge laceration on her head that she bled out of. It was about 6 inches by 6 inches. Her spine was broken, her liver was punctured, and her neck was broken. The coroner said she would have eventually died from 5 different ways, but the most egregious one was her head being opened up from a tremendous wound. So as she's in that tree, that's the trauma to her, but most of it's to the front of her because she went over the cliff on her front. So now, if she's got a blow to the back of the head with binoculars, why would he drag her and even take that responsibility that her head is bouncing on rocks?
Oh, I get it. To generate a reason for her to have this injury in the back of her head.
Yeah, even leave evidence that that's where the back of the head injury happened, was on that rock, not from the top of the cliff. Interesting, huh? But when he lays her down, it's in a bunch of pine needles, and her head was about, I believe, 6 inches lower than her feet. What's the problem with that, with a very egregious head wound?
That's the bleeding out. You should be elevating a wound.
Instead, by the time the coroner tried to draw blood from her the next day, he couldn't even find it, basically. He said there was about a Coke can's worth of blood in her body, that she had bled out into that pine needle and dirt below her. So, if you take what I've told you, she's gone over the edge, she's hit the tree, he's dragged her by her feet, he's laid her head low, and he waits probably 45 to 50 minutes before he calls 911 by the time he's down there. That explains the reason why, doesn't it? She's bled out in there, and the coroner estimated that it took her about an hour to die. So what Harold does, though, he has multiple 911 calls, they keep calling him back, is he says he's giving her CPR, he's taking her pulse and respirations, and he's calling her brother, Barry Bertollet, who's a doctor who had saved Harold's life a couple years ago. They all live in Mississippi, but he's calling Barry and talking with Barry and 911 about her pulse getting just lower and lower and her respirations getting lower until she's gone. And he keeps on pretending to do CPR. I say pretending because we got that on the 911 call when they try to walk him through 30 compressions. And he doesn't change his breathing, doesn't change. You can't hear anything happening. He waits 5 seconds and says, done. You could just hear a silence there from the 911 saying, okay, let's move on, because she could tell he did nothing. So what happened after that is Ranger Faraday gets up there in almost superhuman speed. He's running up with a 50-pound pack to get up there. He sees Harold. He sees Toni lying there. As soon as Harold sees the ranger, he runs over. That's the first time he pretends like he's doing CPR, or that he actually tried it. The ranger tells him to stop. He then sees Toni is dead and declares her dead at 8:12 p.m. So this is how long it took him to get there. He then tells Harold another ranger's coming to watch over Toni and that they will walk down the mountain. As they're walking down, that's when all those texts go out from Harold to his church friend. So Harold lives in Highlands Ranch, like I told you, it's a suburb of Colorado. I live there too. And he's a member of a big local church. And he's texting a lot of his church friends saying, please pray for Toni, she's injured. And then they will come back and say, what happened? And he'll say, head injury. And then he'll say, crit for critical. And then he'll say, please pray. And then they send something back, and then he'll say, my bride is gone. And that started before the ranger got there. But Jerry, it's a psychological study. It's super interesting. As the ranger's walking him down, and he's already declared Toni dead, he texts, we believe, who was going to be a girlfriend of his in Austin, Texas. Starts with the same thing at 9 o'clock. So Toni's been declared dead for over 45 minutes. They're walking down the hill, and he texts this woman named Grace and says, urgent, Toni is injured. She goes, what happened? Head injury. Where are you? You know, what happened? Critical. Please pray. And then finally, my bride is gone. Then he does that to his brother. Then he does it to 3 more church friends. And it's the same canned iteration. This is hours after she's been declared dead. He's asking for prayer. He's saying she's injured. And then, as we said when we're looking at this, and even in some testimony, he's killing her really over and over again, walking his friends through it as he's going down the mountain. He gets to the bottom of the mountain at about 10 o'clock, and he's got 2 friends there. One's a former cop, and another one is a pastor. They both know Harold through church. And the ranger, Faraday, asks Harold, is there anything of value up there? We're going to be there all night. I need to know, because we'll make sure we don't lose anything. And Harold says no. His buddy, the pastor, though, says, Harold, I told Toni to wear her ring today because it's her anniversary. I knew you guys were going to the Stanley. She never wears it because she's a surgeon. So that ring with that monster diamond is going to be on there. It's like a $15,000 to $20,000 diamond. Harold doesn't say a word. And Ranger Faraday says, okay, we'll look for the diamond. Jerry, that diamond was either in Harold's backpack or in his pocket at that point. But he couldn't say anything. And it's because he's not a Scott Kimball serial killer. I mean, yes, he's killed 2 wives, but that's not what he does for a living. I talked a lot to forensics classes about this case because there's a lot to learn. And what I believe is a takeaway here is Harold can't separate the murder scene from his alibi scene. So his alibi is that he's, trying to care for her there, trying to give her CPR, trying to make these 911 calls, when in actuality, he's waiting for her to bleed out. He's seeing his wife die. And as he's seeing her die, he's basically killing her. That's when he takes the diamond out of her ring. Now, her ring, the settings on it, it was a gold settings. It had like the 4 prongs coming up from the ring itself, had twisted because of the impact on the rocks. That's how hard she was hitting them. We had a gemologist testify that the diamond was either likely loose or sitting askew on those prongs. Harold had every right to take the diamond because it's nighttime, it's the side of a mountain. He should have taken it. But in that 1 second when his pastor friend is talking to the ranger, Harold is equating taking the diamond with killing his wife, and he's silent. So this became a huge conversation with Harold and his neighbors, because after this homicide, and if you remember when I interacted with our evidence response team back in 2013, they said they were looking for a diamond in the house, and they said it was super interesting because Harold had been telling his neighbor friends the reason the FBI was investigating him is because they think he stole the diamond, and he would never do that. And he kept telling his friends to go back with him to the scene, and that he thinks the diamond is there at the scene. And his friends are going, no, we're not going back up there to where your wife died. And he's like, well, somebody needs to go with me because I think it's there. And I think if they find the diamond, they'll stop investigating me.
He's looking for someone to go with him so that they can find it. And now
Very
he
good.
has
Yep.
verification. Yeah, I get it.
So our evidence response team actually did a 3D model of the side of this mountain because they know no jury, if this goes to trial, could ever go up there. So they're mapping it with this really cool, tremendous computer software They go down to Toni's recovery spot at the bottom of the cliff, and they see this right where she had been. They see this smoothed out area, where someone had come in and smoothed out all the pine needles, and it's just dirt. And sticking right in the middle of it is Toni's diamond.
Oh, a miracle. The
Mm-hmm.
diamond was there all along.
Except our crime scene photos show that it wasn't there in September of 2012. So sometime between September 2012 and May 28th of 2013, when it was recovered, it mysteriously appeared there. What's your thought? Does that lend more or less credibility to Harold?
Oh, much less, because you're talking about the elements. This is a little tiny diamond, and it just happens to still be visible with all of the being out in the elements and, in a mountainous region. No, I immediately would assume that somebody had sat it there.
You know the rules of evidence. Introducing this stuff into court is very difficult because we don't have him on camera going there. We have him talking about neighbors, but we can't say definitively he put it there. And even if he did, is that just Harold's weirdness, or does it mean he killed Toni?
That was his wife's diamond. So it was his property. I mean, it was his diamond. And so it's just so strange that he took it and then went through that whole scenario to put it back so that the ERT could find it. I take it ended up back with Harold anyway.
He had every right to say it's his at that point. But once the diamond was loose, we believe Harold put it in his pocket or his backpack. He equates the diamond with the homicide. That's what he told his friends. He says, the FBI is investigating me because of the diamond. They think I stole it. And if it's up there, which I think it is, then I think this case will go away. I've seen other cases to where the subject, the defendant, can't separate out the murder part from either the alibi part or the planning part. And Harold's tongue got stuck. His mouth was silent, during that question from his friend. Shouldn't the diamond be up there? Did you get the diamond? Harold knew that was a big mistake of his. He made a couple of big mistakes. The one was the soccer text of saying he was looking at it, and he doesn't pull it up until he's sure Toni's dead 54 minutes later. And then the other was the diamond, of him drawing so much attention to that when it should have just been something very simple. Oh, here it is. But for Harold, I think he was afraid that pulling out that diamond, he would have to explain, well, when did you get that? And again, it's like looking at your spouse when you're killing her. He didn't want to have to talk about any of that murder part of what happened on that cliffside. So I come back from the mountain. My boss assigns me the case, and I hook up with Beth Schott, and she is spectacular. She's the Park Service agent. She's done tons of search warrants. She's interviewed a lot of people. A lot of people were hesitant to talk, Jerry, because of this conservative Christian community that Harold was a part of. They know that his first wife died in a suspicious accident, but he was actually part of their church group way back then, a lot of them. And they just see him as a victim of circumstance because it's so hard to think that someone you not only are friends with, but you share faith with, could ever do something so heinous, not to one wife, but two. And so they were reluctant to talk to the FBI and Park Service when I got the case.
So the case was reassigned to you. What happened to Chris, who was working it when all of this first started?
So Chris worked up in our Fort Collins office, and Chris was wearing multiple hats. That's what we would say. He was doing some headquarters duty. He did not have the time or ability to devote what needed to be devoted to a case like this. Like whether I worked Kimball or Henthorn or some other cases, I had to push all the others to the side and work it completely. And Chris had been going to and from Washington, D.C. He had multiple other cases going, and he just didn't have the time to push that in. Plus, I had a lot of experience, a unique experience working cases like this, and that's why the U.S. attorneys had called me to do it. So I kept in contact with Chris as I was working because he was super fascinated by it, but he didn't have the bandwidth and latitude that I did to work a case like this. So yeah, Beth Schott, the Park Service agent, was kind of in the same boat I was in. Park Service had told her, you work this case till it's done, and the FBI told me work it till it's done. So we both shelved everything else and went for it. The first thing I do when I get a case like this is really go through the file and try to learn everything. And I saw that a lot of key witnesses were reluctant to speak. So I brought Beth out with me to hit them up a second time and not tell them that we think their friend in faith had brutally killed his wives, but that we're just trying to find out what happened. And we just want to know their story and how they knew Toni and how they knew Harold. It was a different take on it because I knew from working cases like this, it's so hard to think that someone you know or related to or friends with could ever do something so heinous. And we did have some success in people not only talking about Toni's death, but the oddness of Lynn's death. And I gave them, Beth and I did, some freedom to then finally offer in some of their not only factual things they saw, but then how it had affected them. And then I built some relationships with them. The other thing that I had learned especially from Kimball's case, is to bring the parents in, to invite them in as almost co-investigators. And that's where Bob and Yvonne, they knew so much more about this marriage between Harold and Toni than we did. And so I was talking with Bob 3-4 times a week, and he sent me a ton of information. I got to learn Harold very well through Bob.
While you're doing this investigation, where is Harold? Is he out he hasn't been charged at all, I guess, so he's just living his life.
He's just living his life in Highlands Ranch. Yep. It's funny because I would work out at the rec centers, and we have four rec centers in Highlands Ranch. And after this case went to trial, and the guy who takes our rec center cards saw it on the news, he says, "You know what, Jonny? This is so weird because sometimes Harold would be on the Precor working out when you're out there playing basketball and your cards would be side by side." Yeah, he's in my community while we're working this case to build up probable cause against him. One of the rabbit trails that I chased, and I was doing this with the permission of the U.S. attorneys, was also looking closely into Lynn's death. Lynn was his first wife, who had died in 1995 when a Jeep fell on her in the middle of nowhere. It's way near the mountains at night, about 10 o'clock at night. And I talked with the Douglas County detective, and he and I started re-interviewing witnesses on Lynn, and those stories, Jerry, were eerily similar, of Harold blaming Lynn for crawling under a Jeep that he had jacked up on a boat jack, which is a horrible jack to jack up a car because it has a spherical top on it instead of a clamp that can clamp to something, so extremely unstable. Detective Weaver, who's from Douglas County, said Harold's story was that Lynn crawled underneath the Jeep while it was up on this boat jack, middle of the night, and the whole Jeep falls on her and crushes her. She suffocated to death. Dana, who's our finance whiz for the U.S. Attorney's Office, found out that Harold profited about $500,000 from Lynn's death. He had insured Lynn 6 months before the homicide, when Lynn had started getting sick at work. In interviewing the key witnesses, Beth had known a lot of this, but I was going back in Harold's life. 1993 is when Harold lost his job at Colorado Christian College. He was married to Lynn at the time. They'd been married about 9 years, and he was a contribution renewal guy, where he would go out, the people who'd been contributing to the college, he would just get them to renew their contributions, and then he started faking it to where he wasn't bringing in anything. And they tried not to fire Harold, but he just kept pretending like he's doing his job, but he wasn't. And it's pretty hard to get fired from an easy job like that, but he finally did. But instead of telling Lynn he got fired, he went home and told her he got a promotion. And now he runs his own business, and it's charitable contributions. So for 2 years in their marriage, Harold was bringing home $0, yet he was pretending like he was going to work. And this is where he would start disappearing on his Thursdays. Lynn was working as a social worker, so not making a ton of money, but Harold was able to manage it, and they were surviving on Harold's no job and Lynn's true job until Lynn started getting sick, and she was going to have not only miss work, but have very expensive surgery, and she wasn't going to be able to have kids, most likely either, which Harold wanted. When Harold finds out this news 6 months before Lynn's crushed by the Jeep, he takes out 2 separate life insurance policies on her. And then 6 months later, he takes her for a ride in the mountains. And as he's changing the tire, Lynn's underneath the Jeep falls on her.
I would love to hear why his explanation as to why she would do something like that?
So Harold told detectives, well, first of all, it was patrol that got there, and patrol had come after EMS had care flighted her out, and before EMS, multiple people had tried to stop to give Harold help on the side of the road. One was even a auto mechanic. We had him testify, and he had shined a light on them, and Harold said, no, 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 I got this. By that, Lynn was not under the car when the auto mechanic came, but she was when the Montoya family came. And they came again at about 10 o'clock at night. They're driving in from the mountains. It's Patricia Montoya, her husband, and her brother. And Harold actually waves them down the middle of the road with his hands, says, my wife's under the car. He points there, and they see a woman underneath the car, and the whole weight of the car, it's on the passenger side tire, except the tire's taken off, so it's what you call the real shiny silver brake disc assembly, that real sharp thing that's there when you take your tire off. That disc is on Lynn's back, so the whole front part of the Jeep is on the middle of her back. And they look at Harold and say, why is she still under there? Because they wouldn't understand why he would go out to get help when he couldn't just jack the car back up and pull her out. And he says, I told her not to go under there, but she did. She went to go try to get a lug nut. So Harold had taken off the tire, and there were lug nuts around this Lynn and the front part of the car. So he said that he had taken the tire out back or around to the back, thrown it in the back of the Jeep, and when he threw it in the back of the Jeep, that's when the whole thing fell on Lynn. If you break that down, again, Jerry, whose fault is it?
Lynn, why did she do that when he told her not to do it?
Exactly. That's why it was very similar. So the Montoyas, as they're really puzzled by this husband who didn't get his wife out from under and asking for help, the husband and brother jack up the car, and Patricia's talking to him, trying to interact with him. They pull Lynn out from under it, and then they turn her over. They ask Harold for his coat because they said, we're going to give her CPR. Can we use your coat for her head to give her something to prop her head up on? And he takes a step back and says, no, this is a new coat.
Oh.
Yeah. So they look at him like, okay, this is getting weirder. They gather some trash up and put it under her head and start giving her CPR. He then tells them, don't touch her. And that's when they let him have it. They say, look, dude, you told us to come help. You waved us down. We are helping her. And Patricia's just observing this as she's watching her husband and brother try to revive Lynn. So she is gone. Patricia goes, calls 911, comes back. They can hear the sirens coming. Lynn starts breathing, and she looks at Harold. She said the blood drained from Harold's face, and he takes a step back. So instead of being excited that his wife is breathing and thanking them, he's scared. And the medical comes, they put her into a helicopter, they fly her out, but she dies from asphyxiation, from suffocation.
Had he even called 911 before he stopped the Montoyas?
No, nobody had a cell phone. This was 95 back then. So Patricia had to go knock on doors until she found one. Yeah, so Patricia, this is an interesting aside. I interviewed her multiple times, and she was a fantastic witness for us on the stand. She's very plain-spoken, but very observant. And she said that she called Douglas County and said, I think this husband killed his wife. But she couldn't give anything besides he was acting really strangely. Harold was very good at crying, at manipulating deputies who showed up, at saying, blaming Lynn, etc. And it was just so odd to everyone. And they did a toxicology. There's no drugs in her system. He didn't drug her. So they're like, must have been free will. People do stupid things. So they looked at it for a while, but then ruled it accidental after a couple days. Patricia, though, couldn't let it go. So that's why she made the phone call. She also told me that she had a dream, and in the dream, she was at the funeral, the memorial, it was in a church, and she could see Harold over there crying. She thought it was fake crying, but she said one woman would come up, hug him, and he would be real excited to hug the woman, but then he would pretend to cry again. And then the next woman would come up, and she said this line of women was just almost endless. I was like, well, that was an interesting dream. And of course, that's not in the police reports. But then Patricia said she went to the memorial, and it was almost just like that.
Wow.
She said it was such an odd memorial that it was all about Harold. The pictures that were up were more about Harold than Lynn. It was about his grief. And all these women were hugging him from the church, and she said it was so weird she had to leave in the middle of it. So I was learning about Lynn and Toni, but we didn't know, Jerry, we could get Lynn's death in because it was already ruled an accident.
So why did you bother investigating Lynn's death?
Well, the two prosecutors, Valerie and Sunita, said it could possibly come in as what's called 404B evidence, relevant prior bad acts. So they were looking into it, but part of it is I just can't help myself on stuff like that because I was so curious that they both die in the same way. And I also didn't know if learning something about Lynn's death could help me with Toni's death because I had some witnesses that were there for both. So I would say if it's a pie chart, 80% of my investigation is all into Toni, but some of it would bleed over into Lynn. And when it would, I would, do an interview or two there. After Lynn dies, Harold collects the money and then he takes a 5-year, I would call it, hunting period until he can find a very successful, Christian, wealthy wife that he can control. And he did this through online Christian dating. It was just getting started there in the late 90s. And he represented himself as someone who was very successful in the church. He had lots of money, which he did. He had $450,000 from Lynn's death. And that he was just looking for a very godly wife. Toni had just come out of a very rough relationship. Her parents were hoping that some Christian man would come in and sweep her off her feet there. She's in Mississippi, working 2 different medical offices, just, busting her butt, trying to serve people and whatever. She really has a servant's heart and cares about people a ton. But once Harold came in, he not only swept Toni off her feet, he swept her parents off their feet because of how he represented himself as this knight in shining armor. Some warning signs that they all ignored, which we do when something looks very spectacular up front. Harold said he's built Toni a mansion here in Colorado. He was able to get the dad, Bob, to invest $100,000 in it prior to them even getting married. He goes, we're going to take him back. I'm going to, you build Toni this $1 million mansion. It's about a $400,000 home, and the only money put down on it was the $100,000 that he took from Toni's dad. Prior to the wedding also, Toni's mom, Yvonne, this was about a month prior to the wedding, noticed that $100,000 was missing out of Toni's savings account. Harold and Toni have been dating for a while now, and when she asked Toni about it, she could see that her eyes were like, I don't know what you're talking about. Toni came back and told Mom, yeah, Harold borrowed the money, but it's fine. She's like, did he not tell you? And Toni just brushed it aside like it was no big deal. Harold used that money to buy a cabin in the mountains, which will come into play in just a minute. He tried to kill Toni at this cabin prior to the cliff push. And then finally, at the wedding itself, the groom's portion is the rehearsal dinner, right? So they're having the rehearsal dinner. They're in Mississippi. Toni has 2 brothers, Barry and Todd. Harold goes to Todd when it's time to pay the check and says, hey, Todd, I didn't bring my checkbook. Can you cover this for me? It's no problem for me. I don't remember at this point. Jerry, I think it's like $3,000-$4,000 for the rehearsal dinner. And Todd's like, sure. Because again, Harold's a multimillionaire. After the dinner, may have been that day, a day or two later, Harold goes to Todd, pats him on the back and says, thanks for the rehearsal dinner.
Wow. So is he working? Does he have a job? Is he bringing any money?
No, he is telling. We have some of Beth was able through her search warrants to get some of the communications between Harold and Toni back then. And he's saying things like, I just resigned after 9.5 years, my position with resource development. That's who had been faking his job with Lynn. And he goes, but it's because I got a promotion. And they're asking me to speak and whatever else. And I'm looking forward to this making even more money. And he says, I'm getting lots of money. It's an unbelievable amount. I'm staying at the Hilton Airport out here in California. He's representing to them that he's uber successful. But then he also has, Jerry, which this hurt him in our case as well. He keeps notes to himself and he would write his own little diary. And like on January 5th of 2000, this is before they get married, he goes, Toni's friends are liking me more. Toni told her mom she might be willing to move to Denver. Wedding location, though, will be in Jackson. It's okay now to tell her dad about my net worth. It's like he's writing these notes to himself. And then he finally writes 2 weeks later, neither Toni or I have any interest in a prenup. So what we found out in that 5-year hunting period, I would call it hunting, is because we had only one of these women come and testify, but he would target these Christian women through the dating site, and then he would ask them on the first or second date if they own their own home, how much equity they have, something else about their job and net worth. And then one of them, her name's Virginia, didn't answer the right way on her net worth, and he never called her again. So that's why I call it a hunting period. Once he found Toni, and Toni was so passionate about her job that she was fine with Harold coming in and controlling the finances, even the relationship, because she wanted to marry a Christian husband who was successful, and she didn't have to worry about taking care of all the other stuff, which was perfect for Harold because now he could fake his job and she would never know. They moved to Colorado. Toni is making good money. I'd say close to $200,000 being a doctor there in Cherry Creek. Plus, her parents have oil money that comes in. I think it was about $100,000 to $200,000 per year. So Toni's side of the family is bringing in enough money to where Harold was representing he made $100,000, but nobody ever knew he didn't because enough money was coming.
What a conniving man.
Yep, and I've seen that in it's different types of faith sometimes where one spouse will control another one by saying you must conform to the way we believe, and it's the way really that Harold believed, not even as much the faith itself. And it was that Harold started exerting more and more control over her to where he would have her phone calls forwarded to him. So when Bob and Yvonne would try to call Toni, he would pick up the phone because her cell phone would forward to his. And he would call them for money and say, we're paying for a private education for our daughter Haley. We're not have enough money. They were confused because they knew Toni was making good. They thought Harold was good. But, they would even send more money on top of that. And Harold was just squirreling all this stuff away. He controlled what colors Toni wore. She used to like lavender, and she never got to wear it again after they were married. And her close friends were just appalled. But again, what Harold did was take her out of that Mississippi situation, which is close to family and friends, bring her here to Colorado. She's working all the time. She becomes friends with people at work, and they see this controlling behavior as troublesome, but they're not her close friends, so they don't really intervene. Even the Wi-Fi, Jerry, and they didn't find this out till after Toni was dead. They had a relative living there at the house. His name's Daniel, and he would come in and out, help babysit some, which the babysitter's a whole different deal. Because when Harold would go out of, quote, work jobs on Thursdays and disappear, they would have to hire a babysitter. And the babysitter would watch Haley as she was growing up because Toni's working all the time. Harold supposedly got this really important job where he leaves on Thursdays. And at times, this nephew Daniel would come and stay. And Daniel, though, told us that he couldn't get Wi-Fi at the house because Harold said he didn't believe in Wi-Fi until Toni died. Daniel said within a week after Toni died, they had Wi-Fi at the house. So we're talking more and more control that he was exercising over Toni. What killed Toni was she was finally getting her footing against Harold. In 2011, so 11 years into their marriage, she gets an offer to be a partner at Cherry Creek Eye Surgeons. Harold started arguing with her openly that she is not going to be a partner. He's telling her the equipment's going to cost too much. It's not worth our time and money. In front of their good friends, Toni pushes back and she goes, no, this is what I've always wanted. She knows it's about money for Harold. So she goes, Harold, it's going to bring in even more money. And he goes, you're not doing it. And she goes, yes, I am. So that's the first time she stood up to him. Again, this is April 2011, so just over a year before he kills her. In May, after she stood up to him multiple times, he changes life insurance policies. Right, but by the time they're arguing, he has $6 million of life insurance on her. But he checks it in April and finds that one company has bought another one. So she's doubly insured under one of the companies. Otherwise, it was 4 separate insurance, so nobody would know the others would pay out because you're not supposed to have multiple life insurance policies on the same person. So he does a check, finds out that one company has bought another one, and so now she's doubly insured for $3 million, and he cancels the double insurance policy. So now it's $4.5 million. Then he tells Toni, let's go to the cabin. And they go to the cabin, which is the one he bought with her money. It backs up to a lake. It's near Lake Granby up here in Colorado. It's about a 2-hour drive from Denver back in the mountains. And when they get there, he tells Toni that there's a light broken down at the bottom of their deck. The first floor has a walkout deck, and then there's stairs going down near the lake. And you have to go down those stairs, and it's super dark down there. But there's some spotlights that could shine. And Harold says, one of them's broken, and I need you to go fix it, Toni. 10 o'clock at night. They've just got there. They've got their daughter Haley inside. I'm married, Jerry, and I know that if I would even say something close like that to my wife, that I need something fixed at 10 o'clock at night in a very dark place under the deck, the nicest thing she would say to me is, you can fix it yourself. But Toni goes down, and she starts picking up the shards. The next thing she knows is she's sitting there with a fractured vertebra, and a board has hit her in the back of the head. It's basically the top of your neck, base of your head. And EMTs are on the scene, and she doesn't even know what happened. And Harold's explaining to the EMTs that she was down there picking up glass, and a board. Oh, the first story, I got to get his stories correct because he told 3 different ones. He told them that he was working on the roof and that he was flinging a board off the roof, and that it happened to hit Toni in the back of the head.
At 10 o'clock at night.
People that know Harold knows he's not handy at all, first of all, and that he would be on a ladder working on the roof at 10 is ridiculous. But this isn't law enforcement. These are EMTs, and their job is not to vet his story. Their job is to make sure Lynn's okay. He tells his friends back home that he was flinging plywood off the deck, and I went and took pictures of the plywood. The plywood there, even years later, is 4 foot by 8 foot by 3/4. So these are big pieces of plywood, and you wouldn't fling any of them off any deck. And finally, he just tells them a board fell on her, and he wasn't even around. So 3 different stories, but cops were never involved in this. This, though, prompts her parents to start looking into their relationship. She has a 72-minute phone call with them, and Bob and Yvonne say, we're not comfortable with you being even alone with your husband anymore. We think this was an attempt on your life, and he's not getting any more of the family oil money. So you take his name off of that. Toni agrees. It's not with can't be alone with him, but she goes to First Bank, takes Harold's name off their joint account. That's a humongous problem for her, because who has a stranglehold on the money? Harold. She doesn't even tend to the money, so she doesn't even know what their bank account balance is, but she takes Harold off. That happened on July 13th of 2012. So she dies 3 months later.
Does Harold find out? Does he know that she's taken his name off?
Yeah, he checks the bank accounts daily. He's the one doing all these insurance policies manipulations. He's the one taking the Bertollet money in and squirreling it away in different accounts. So he would have known, if not that day, a day or two afterwards. That's what he does, is manage their money. So she's cutting him off, but she doesn't know at that point that he's faking his job. And so she doesn't know that by taking his name off the account, she's basically ripping his mask off, a mask that he's worn for 20 years, that he's a successful businessman, because he's going to be found out now.
Oh, so she is so out of the finances that she doesn't realize he's not bringing any money into the home.
You're correct.
Wow. What was the time frame between the incident at the cabin and the push off the mountain?
So we call it the beam incident. The beam incident at the cabin happened in May 2011, and the push off the cliff was September 2012. So a little over a year in between.
The parents believed that he was trying to kill her during the beam incident at the cabin. What did they say Toni believed happened? Because she stayed with him.
She stayed with him for over a year, and I believe that it had to do with what she believed was her role in the Christian faith, is that the husband is the leader, listen to your leader, follow your leader, etc. And that goes to, Jerry, the 3 things that happened with Lynn and Toni. Toni told her parents one time, they stood up, they said, listen, we're going to tell Harold that this is ridiculous and that you are not going to be put in that situation again. They're trying to get her to stand up against him, but she wouldn't. And she said, look, if you call him out on anything, I will be the one to pay the price. And she says, it's just easier to do what he says than to argue with him. and wondering why she would go down to the deck at 10 o'clock at night and wondering why she would take this really difficult trail down over multiple rocks as her knee had to be really hurting. And she's wondering, how is this even close to an anniversary? It's that. She's like, it'll be easier to do what he says than to argue with him because that would create a whole different environment. I believe at this point in Toni's life, Jerry, that she was just solely focused on being the best mom for Haley that she could be. And that she's married to Harold as part of her duty and responsibility and whatever else. But she wanted to be a great mom for Haley and a great doctor. And so she's just putting up with Harold in the only way she knew how to. So all of this was known to the case agents, or, Beth and the U.S. attorneys, but I had got up to speed on that. I'd helped bring in some more witnesses, but we didn't have planning or premeditation. I mean, we had the insurance policies, but the U.S. attorneys didn't think it was quite enough to go to trial on because it's so circumstantial. And I looked back through our case file. I'd been studying it a lot, and I found in one of the 1As probable cause. Do you remember what a 1A is from your time or no?
Oh, absolutely. The little white envelope
Right, yeah.
that you attach to the back of the file and collect non-bulky evidence.
Correct. Yeah. So it's not in our evidence, but it's not in the computerized file either. And what was in one of our 1As, so for us, I'd call it an in-between thing, was Harold's cell phone records and the plotted GPS of each of them. And it was a monster bunch of paper, but it wasn't even a CD. They had just printed out a bunch of data with GPS locations. And it had never been looked at. It had just slipped through the cracks. So I pull those out and start plotting, and I'm able to go, it had it all the way back to January 1st of 2012. The first thing I start looking for is Thursdays, right? Because that's when he disappears. And I find, Jerry, that on Thursdays, 9 times out of 10, he leaves his house in Highlands Ranch. He drives about 8 miles northwest, and he's in a shopping center for 4 hours, from like 6 p.m. or 5 p.m. to 9 p.m. And then his cell phone just disappears, kind of. I don't see any activity until he's back at home, maybe Saturday morning or Friday night. So I tell Beth what I've found is like 90% of the time, he's in this shopping center from 5 to 9 when he's got Haley being babysat. He's saying he's building churches, making money, but he's in a shopping center. And so we go there, start knocking on doors. I bring his picture with me, and I end up talking to a manager of Panera Bread. And she's like, yeah, I know that guy. I don't know his name, but he comes in almost every Thursday. She says, nobody else will deal with him. Her name's Christine. She says, he'll only come to me. Here's his routine. He comes in. He waits for Christine to wait on him. She says, okay, hi, how are you doing? I'm good. Are you feeling slim or not so slim today? I'm feeling slim. Oh, good. Then you want the turkey cheddar sandwich and you want the Coke and chips, right? Yes. Good. And then if he's feeling not slim, then she orders the salad for him and the Diet Coke. But nobody else knows that little routine. And so he will even be rude to the other people behind the counter until Christine comes and waits on him because he wants her to tell him what he wants. And then he would get that entree, go to the very back, and she says he was pretending to work for 4 hours, but she could see him looking at the internet and surfing around and just pretending like he's working when he's not. So that was just super odd. Christine ended up testifying because, again, that's what he's representing, is that he's this church builder, big money maker. However, following that July, when he's taking off the First Bank account, I see those Thursdays change. His phone starts heading north to Estes Park, Colorado. And that happens 1 month before the homicide, actually 5 weeks before the homicide. And he will go all the way up to the cell tower where he ends up calling 911. And he does that, Jerry, 9 different times. So he not only starts going on Thursdays, what I can see from the data is he starts getting excited about it. He starts leaving on Saturdays, and then he's gone all day Sunday, and then he's gone Tuesday. What I also see in the phone records is he starts calling Grace. Grace is Lynn's, his first wife's sister-in-law. And I believe he's attracted to Grace, and Grace believes that at this point too, that he almost starts focusing in on her. And during a lot of these trips up north to the place where he's going to kill Toni, he starts reaching out for Grace.
I have to ask you about Grace. Does Does Grace have money?
Grace does not. Grace, though, she has, 4 beautiful daughters. She lives in Austin. She's a very lovely person. And I think that it's just someone that Harold thought he could hang, whether he's going to marry her, whether he's going to target her and kill her. That's what, at this point, that's what she thinks. I don't know that he was, don't know that he wasn't. He was giving a lot of attention to Grace, even to the point of one of the last pictures that he sent to everyone was him and Toni when they arrived in Rocky Mountain National Park. He sends this picture of them smiling beside each other. Instead of sending that, he sends a picture to Grace of him and Grace in his last visit there to Austin, which had only happened a couple weeks prior. Something going on there, but don't know for sure. But there's just a lot of calls during his trips up there. Then on trip number 6 is when I think he finds the spot out of 9, because he starts calling after that. The Cherry Creek eye surgeons start setting up this wonderful anniversary trip, and he calls the Stanley Hotel as he's going up on trip 7. So if you go all the way back to the call, how he knew the latitude and longitude when he's supposed to be under stress calling 911, it's because he's rehearsed this thing 9 times. This 9-trip thing was the one tiny push past the goal line that our U.S. attorneys needed to show premeditation, because Harold had told the Rangers he'd only been up there once, and it was once in the past. It was about 3 months ago.
But in reality, it sounds like he went there at least 7 times before?
Yeah, a total of 9, including the trip there that day. But yeah, 8 preparation trips. And the later ones, Jerry, he would turn off his cell phone as he got close. So I would just see a gap. I'd see him tracking north, going towards the park, and then it would be like a 5-hour gap in where he's turning his phone off because he's hiding his location, knowing that we would eventually get warrants.
Talking about premeditated. Wow.
Correct. Yep. And that's the jury. I was surprised that, Harold accepted that. When I was testifying on the stand to my research into the 9 trips and even the gaps there, instead of shaking his head no and thinking it's preposterous that that's premeditation, I remember looking at Harold because he's there at the defense table, and he's just nodding his head up and down like I had done my homework and like, okay, fine. Sure, I was up there 9 times. And the jury sees all that stuff, In my opinion, he should have been shaking his head no, like that's preposterous. I was going up there just to sightsee. But yeah, but with all the groundwork that Beth and Valeria and Sunita had done, the 9 trips it's too big of a lie for him to protect. The other thing that had happened prior to trial is the U.S. attorneys had argued that 404B motion not only to bring in Lynn's death as a prior bad act, but even, we called it the beam incident, where Harold dropped a beam on Toni's head a year before the homicide. And they argued that because both of those situations were so similar in that the insurance was manipulated, he isolated them, he told lies about what happened, he staged them as accidents. And even, as an aside, they didn't say this, he used gravity each time. It's something falling, right? It's either the Jeep falling on Lynn, it's something falling on Toni's head, and it's Toni falling. There were some big arguments. Both had appellate attorneys there in the courtroom because they were having to weigh, did the jury need to hear these, or are they just prejudicial and not related to the trial? But after long hearings, that's what made the difference. Jerry and Harold being convicted, in my opinion, was not only a great case on Toni that Beth had built, but these 2 other bad acts show that Toni could not have been an accident.
Can we go back a little bit and talk about the final decision of what you were going to charge him with and what occurred when you went to arrest him, or when he learned that he had been officially federally charged for the murder of his wife?
That is a very short but fascinating story on what we charged him with. So on November 5th, of 2014, we got an arrest warrant for first-degree homicide of Toni. We aren't charging him with Lynn. That's a relevant evidence case, but it was going to come in the trial. But it's first-degree homicide. We go to arrest him. He now has sole control of Haley. We were very concerned about Haley because she was 9 by now, 9 years old. And we wanted to make sure that he dropped her off at school first, so she wasn't in the house or around him. And we were working with Douglas County Sheriff's Office, so we had a big arrest plan. And the plan was that Beth and I could be the ones to first talk to him and put cuffs on him because we were going to bring him down to the federal courthouse and see if he would talk. But the sheriffs they had so many resources there that Beth and I, by the time he had dropped Haley off before they pulled him over, we were probably 10 cars back. So they didn't want anything, bad to happen. So we had way too many resources there. I go up to introduce myself to Harold. He's already in cuffs. I say, Harold, we have an arrest warrant for you. He's like, for what? I said, well, it's first-degree homicide for Toni. He said, that's preposterous. He goes, who are you? I said, well, I'm the FBI agent in charge of our part of the case. This is Beth Schott. She's with the Park Service. And he says, oh, you're just an agent? Why didn't you just make me an appointment? I would have just gone to meet the judge. You don't need to do all this handcuff thing. I said, Mr. Henthorn, this is first-degree murder. I said, we can't have you just make an appointment with the judge. And he just turns his head aside like I don't even mean anything to him. So we put him back in the back of my car. We're taking him downtown, and we're asking him. We have another agent there, Pat, who asked him, he's filling out the prisoner intake form, and he says, well, ask here your occupation. And so we all just sit there quietly like, what's he going to say? Because he knows we know that he's been faking it for 20 years. And we all just wait. And I say, Mr. Henthorn, if you don't want to answer, you can just say unemployed or self-employed. He goes, yeah, self-employed. I said, okay. Or no, I think he actually said unemployed. He did. And then we get to the marshal's office, and there's a young female marshal booking him in. You can tell he's wanting to impress her. And she asked him, what's your occupation? And he says, oh, I'm a fundraiser, very successful. It's related to church. We're all standing there, Jerry. And he had just told us that he knew we knew, but he couldn't help himself in front of this new person to, again, represent himself as something that he wasn't. And I think this goes to, again, the reason for the homicide for both Lynn and Toni is unknowingly they were tearing this mask off of Harold. Lynn, because she was going to have expensive surgery and miss work, and so they would have $0 coming in. Toni, because she had stood up to him and was ripping off his mask by not having him on their joint account. But it wasn't just the money, it's that he had spent a lifetime building this fake reputation and standing in this community. He was willing to kill both of them to protect that. I've grown really close to Toni's family, including her brother Barry, and especially mom and dad, and learning more and more about, how, and I've seen it in other cases, how difficult it is to lose your daughter or your sister to something like this. And Harold continues to write letters to his daughter, Haley, and she doesn't read them. And it's still Toni's fault. Even today, we're a little over 10 years past it, almost coming up on 11. And Haley doesn't read his letters. She's actually changed her last name from Henthorn to her mom's maiden name. And she's in a good spot right now.
How old is she now?
She's 18. And she's had a very good high school career. But she was so oppressed under Harold for those 2 years that there was a lot of rehabilitation that Toni's whole family just took Haley under their wings. And she is very bright. She's a lot like her mom, very bright, her great grades, social. I've kept up with her because Yvonne, Toni's mom, and my mom became really good friends through the trial. My mom actually came from Lubbock, Texas, and watched the trial, and she sat with Yvonne. I didn't orchestrate any of it, trust me. But they've become close friends, and Yvonne has shared Haley's life growing up apart from Harold, and that she was able to get out from underneath him and that poison he was feeding her for 2 years, that it's your mom's fault. It wasn't mine, that she's not here.
And those were the 2 years after she died, before he was charged with her murder.
That's correct. But I forward those emails from Yvonne to our whole team, to Beth, Valeria, and Sunita, and we're really grateful we were able to rescue Haley from that and that the case worked out like it did.
So how long did the trial last? How many witnesses? And when the verdict was read, I would love to hear how Harold reacted.
The trial, it's funny because last week Harold exhausted his last appeal. He's been appealing this all the way up to the Supreme Court for his 2015 conviction. And we had probably 50 witnesses on our witness list. I would bet we had about 30 to 35 actually testify. They started with the park rangers, and they were fantastic. It was almost like having a guided tour through Rocky Mountain National Park. They talked about what this mountain was like, what this cliff was like, how nobody else goes there, and then the oddities of Harold when they respond, the 911 call. So the jury was able to see very clearly that this was not normal, what happened with Toni. And then we couldn't take the jury there, but we were in a 12-story courthouse in downtown Denver. They were able to take the jury to an exact point and stand up on a bench and look down out of the window to see the distance Toni fell when Harold was saying she fell 30 feet. And it's awful to look out that window and see pavement below. But then they, like I said, Toni's mom, Yvonne, testified. We did have quite a few friends, probably 7 or 8 of Harold's friends, some who had seen Lynn, walked through Lynn's death with Harold, and then also Toni's, and just the statements that they had made. We had the coroner come and testify to the causes of death to Toni, and that she was most likely alive for an hour. And, that none of that, of course, the jury's putting together this puzzle quickly. That all came in for Toni. Dana testified to the finances. We had different insurance people come up and testify. Harold's friend and longtime insurance confidant, his name's Neil Cresswell. He's passed away now as well. He was almost 90 at the time he testified, but he had helped put together those 4 $1.5 million insurance policies for Toni for Harold, thinking that they were canceled each time and just renewing, not that Harold was stacking policies on them. He thought Harold was a great guy, which made him not think he was capable. We did multiple interviews with Mr. Cresswell, but once he saw that those policies were stacking on Toni, he told the jury, I remember him walking up, Harold was smiling at Mr. Cresswell when he's walking up, thinking, finally, one of my friends are going to get up and rescue me. Mr. Cresswell gets up and says, yeah, I did not know he was stacking those policies. And a quote that still sticks with me today, overinsured people tend to die. And they asked him, the prosecutor asked, what do you mean by that? He goes, well, Toni was worth more dead than she was alive. That was really devastating for Harold to hear, who he thought was his best friend, say words like that. But all of our witnesses came in very well. And then it moved from that to the beam incident. They had the EMTs come testify. They had some of Toni's friends afterwards. Of course, Yvonne had already testified that she said, don't stay alone with Harold and he doesn't get any of our oil money. So the beam incident and Douglas County Sheriff's Office, we had the deputies. Now they're 20 years in. A lot of them were new, and they talked about knowing that Lynn was under the car, the crime scene there, Harold telling differing stories back then, which they didn't put the pieces together until much later, and then Patricia Montoya and her family talking about how awful it was that Harold was reacting to his wife being under a Jeep. The U.S. attorneys, Jerry, both Valeria and Sanita, were fantastic in talking to the jury about direct versus circumstantial evidence, because all of this was circumstantial, right? We didn't have anybody seeing Harold do these because he had isolated Lynn and Toni so well. We had no eyewitnesses to these things happening. And yet Valeria said, yeah, there's a difference between direct and circumstantial. Direct evidence, let's say it's snowing outside, you walk out, you feel the snow hitting your face, that's direct because you are there experiencing it. Circumstantial is you're inside sleeping, it snows outside, you walk out and you see the snow. You know it snowed, but you weren't there to see it. She goes, that's what we're presenting you today, is circumstantial evidence. It doesn't change evidence, it's just different than direct. She set that in front of the jury before and then went back to it at the end. So the prosecution was fantastic. And it was 2 weeks of testimony from what I remember. And almost all of it was the prosecution. The defense didn't call Harold because in the opening, Harold's attorney, Craig Truman, had to say this: my client is a liar. Why do you have to say that? He had lied about his job for 20 years. His attorney was in a box because Harold had lied most of his adult life, and that was going to come out. Harold then wanted to testify, or was making a show of wanted to testify at the end. But if you say that to start, is there any way he can be on the stand when his own attorney has called him a liar, and so has everybody else? And that's what the judge told him. He's like, Mr. Henthorn, you're fine testifying, but your own attorney said this, and so did everybody else. So I don't know how we could say what you're telling us will be the truth. So he decided not to testify. And then the jury didn't come back that afternoon. We had to come in again the next day. I think they had it for about 2-3 hours, and then came in at around, from my recollection, lunchtime or so the next day with a guilty verdict. They did poll the jurors one by one, and each one resolutely said guilty.
And as a narcissist, as we've determined that Harold is, how did he react to that?
Yeah, Beth and I took turns watching Harold throughout the trial, and his reactions, just like when Neil Cresswell walked up, were not commensurate with how they should be reacting if you're on trial for your wife's death. Even when Yvonne was up there, Harold, when he should have been crying, was just sitting there with a smile, and then he would cry at inopportune times as well. He would take furious notes at times, and then he would just be drawing. We were trying to figure out what would make Harold react like a normal human. After day like 2 or 3, we think his attorneys just told him, try not to show any emotion, because in our opinion, he wasn't showing it at the right time. So I don't even remember his reaction during the guilty verdict. He was probably just sitting there. But I had listened to his prison phone calls for 1 year leading up to the trial, because he was being held at FCI Inglewood, and he would call all of he had a handful of friends at that point. He said this whole trial said the same thing over again. Heinous nonsense. That's what he would call it. He was more concerned, Jerry, with what suit he would wear and what colors would look good on him in the courtroom than his defense strategy. Like you said, narcissistic behavior, even to the day of. And they would say, well, how do you feel about this? And instead of talking about the trial, he'd say, yeah, I've got a suit picked out, and it's one from my closet. I'm going to wear this tie. And it's just like he did for 20 years. It's the outward projection of who he was representing and not concerned about what's really going on.
Well, this has been a fascinating case review. Just seeing the way he thought and how manipulative he was is just mind-blowing.
It is. Yeah, and I've seen versions of control of other spouses, whether it's over their spouse or sometimes a parent over a child, to become that controlling. But the faking the job for 20 years in this pretty intelligent community and getting away with it is pretty impressive. You know, the lengths he would go to maintain this image and how important it was to him.
So what was the final sentence, and where is he now?
I haven't kept track of him since he's been sentenced. But the final sentence was life in prison without possibility of parole.
All right. Well, it sounds like we've come to the end of this case review.
That's it. It's one of the few cases where I've formed some deeper relationships with the family and my co-case agents. I mean, with Sunita, Valeria, and Beth, we're still friends. Something like this that draws so much out of you can't help but form deeper relationships with those you work with and work for.
Well, usually at this part of the episode, I ask you my standard question, when and why you joined the FBI. But we did cover that already in episode 276. So what I'd rather do now is to just catch up with what you're doing now and then have you give us your last word. So are you still working at the school system?
I'm still working with Douglas County School District. It's in the same community, that Harold was operating in. I really enjoy it. I am able to use a lot of what I learned in the FBI to help keep our kids and staff safe. I work very closely with law enforcement and with each of the principals. When students' thinking become, unhealthy, we're able to come in and help bump them back into healthy thinking. But our law enforcement partners are great. I have had some FBI cases go to trial, which I testified in earlier this year, and I think I'll have a few more that are hopefully wrapped up. So I still have one foot kind of there, but I do really miss the FBI. It was very good to me, Jerry. I'm sure you can say the same with the passion for what you do, but I encourage kids that I speak with to try it out as a career that, you can make good life choices, good decisions, and maybe someday you can find some career that you can enjoy as much as I enjoyed the FBI.
It sounds like we may have another opportunity to have you back to review some more cases, but I know you were working on a book. How's that project coming along?
It's basically a look into my investigation to Scott Kimball. The FBI is reviewing it now, and they give me permission, then I can move forward to finding out if anybody wants to edit it, publish it, that sort of thing. I have written a draft on Henthorn, but it's just more my notes and the things that I observed going through. It's not close to a book, but it is kind of my journal. So we'll see how this Kimball thing works out first.
Well, we're looking forward to reading your true crime book, hopefully coming out in the near future. At this time, I want to give you the last word. So what would you like to say?
I think the lesson that we can learn from Harold is to not only be careful of dealing with the narcissist, but to address narcissism when it comes up inside of each one of us. Because I do believe it's a give and take on if you start thinking too much of yourself, you think less and less of other people. Be very careful if you're dealing with someone who is very self-centered, because even though that self-centered person may make you think you're important to them, you're not. And I also try to make that applicable to myself in a case like this where I start thinking I'm too important. Remember Harold and how dangerous it is to think too much of yourself and to be more focused on other people than yourself.
And that's the end of the interview. In your podcast app's description of this episode, there's a link to the show notes at jerrywilliams.com, where you'll find a photo of Jonny Grusing, links to news articles about this case, several photos from the many quote-unquote accident sites where Harold Henthorn attempted to or killed his wives, and there's a link to Grusing's first FBI Retired Case File Review, episode 276, about serial killer Scott Kimball. I hope you enjoyed the interview and that you'll share it with your friends, family, and associates. You can show me just how much you liked it by buying me a coffee. There's a link in your podcast app's description of this episode, or you can visit jerrywilliams.com and tap on the little coffee cup icon in the bottom right-hand corner of my website. Don't forget to follow FBI Retired Case File Review on your favorite podcast app. Now, this podcast is all about true crime, but if you're also interested in crime fiction, once a month via my reader team email, I keep you up to date on the FBI and books, TV, and movies. When you join my reader team, you get access to my FBI reading resource, a colorful list of more than 70 books about the FBI written by FBI agents who have been guests on this podcast. There's nonfiction, crime fiction, true crime, and memoirs. You'll also get my FBI reality checklist, where I debunk 20 cliches about the FBI and receive news about what I'm up to and about my FBI nonfiction and crime fiction books. I want to thank you for listening to the very end. I hope you come back for another episode of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. Thank you.